April 29th, 1942. 11:27 post-meridiem. Above the Bismarck Sea, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Pollock tightened his grip on the control column of PBY Catalina Boat One as fires from Corregidor lit the horizon like a malevolent sunrise. Through the scratched plexiglass windscreen, he could see flames consuming what remained of the rock, orange and red tongues, licking at ammunition dumps, fuel stores, and the shattered remnants of American resistance in the Philippines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the Japanese forces ringing the fortress did not know was that in the next 45 minutes, 2 flying boats would attempt what military planners in Australia had labelled borderline suicidal. Land on open water at night. Load 46 souls, including critically wounded personnel and army nurses. Take off again before Japanese artillery could find the range. All while fires burned bright enough to illuminate every detail for enemy gunners on Bataan, just 2 miles away. The mathematics of survival were brutal. Corregidor had endured 143 days of siege. Today alone, the Japanese had celebrated Emperor Hirohito's birthday by firing approximately 10,000 shells and bombs at the 5-square-mile island. Every anti-aircraft battery was destroyed or silenced. Most of the coastal guns lay wrecked. The hospital tunnels overflowed with wounded. Water was rationed. Food was running out. And yet, 46 people were about to bet their lives that 2 obsolete patrol planes could slip through the Japanese blockade, land in hostile waters under a full moon, and escape before dawn revealed them to every enemy gun within range. The story of how Pollock came to be here, flying through darkness toward a burning island that official Washington had already written off, began 2 weeks earlier in Perth, Western Australia. The transformation from routine to audacious started with a simple question posed by Lieutenant Commander Edgar T. Neal, commanding officer of what remained of Patrol Wing 10. Could 2 PBYs make it to Corregidor and back? February 1942. Pearl Harbor smouldered. Wake Island had fallen. Guam was lost. Singapore would surrender in days. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable, swallowing territory at a pace that stunned even the most pessimistic Allied planners. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces fought a desperate delaying action on the Bataan Peninsula, while Corregidor, the fortified island at the mouth of Manila Bay, became the last stronghold. General Douglas MacArthur had evacuated to Australia on March 11th, leaving Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright to command the doomed garrison. MacArthur's departure by PT boat through Japanese-controlled waters made headlines. His promise, "I shall return," became instant legend. But for the 11,000 troops still holding Corregidor, MacArthur's promise meant nothing without supplies, reinforcements, and some hope of eventual relief. None were coming. By April, Washington had made the cold calculation. Corregidor could not be held. The Philippines could not be saved. Every resource would go toward building forces in Australia for the eventual counter-offensive. The men and women on Corregidor would have to surrender when ammunition ran out, and hunger made further resistance impossible. But not everyone accepted this verdict. Admiral Thomas C. Hart, commander of the decimated Asiatic Fleet, argued that certain key personnel, critical intelligence documents, and a handful of nurses should be evacuated while evacuation remained theoretically possible. The Navy had already used submarines to pull out a few dozen people. President Manuel Quezon of the Philippines, Commissioner Francis Sayer, and selected staff had escaped that way. On April 8th, a submarine had evacuated 27 naval officers and men. Submarines, however, could only carry small numbers. The Japanese had increased patrols around Manila Bay. Each evacuation attempt grew more dangerous. What remained were the nurses. Nearly 100 Army nurses and 1 Navy nurse, Lieutenant Anne Bernatitis, who had worked in field hospitals throughout the Bataan campaign. They had treated casualties under fire, performed surgery without anesthesia when morphine ran out, amputated limbs by lantern light in jungle clearings. When Bataan fell on April 9th, they evacuated to Corregidor through Japanese artillery bombardment, arriving at Malinta Tunnel with whatever supplies they could carry. The nurses faced a grim future. If Corregidor fell, as everyone knew it must, female prisoners of war would be at the mercy of Japanese captivity. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected medical personnel, but recent reports from Hong Kong and Singapore suggested that Japanese forces did not always honor such niceties. General Wainwright wanted the nurses out. Getting them out required aircraft. The last American planes in the Philippines had been destroyed weeks ago. The Japanese controlled the skies absolutely. Any aircraft approaching Corregidor would face fighter intercept, anti-aircraft fire from both sides of Manila Bay, and the near certainty of destruction, unless it came at night. Unless it was a flying boat that could land on water, load passengers in darkness, and disappear before dawn. Unless it was crewed by pilots insane enough or brave enough to try. Patrol Wing 10 had started the war with 46 PBY Catalinas, based at Cavite Naval Air Station and Olongapo. By December 10, 1941, Japanese bombers had destroyed or damaged most of them on the ground. The survivors fled south, operating from seaplane tenders in the Dutch East Indies. By March, only 2 airworthy PBYs remained in Australia. These were old aircraft, worn by months, of combat operations, maintained by crews scrounging parts from wrecked planes. The consolidated PBY-5 Catalina was never designed for the mission now proposed. A patrol bomber, the flying boat measured 63 feet long with a wingspan of 104 feet. 2 Pratt & Whitney radial engines producing 1,200 horsepower each gave it a maximum speed of 175 miles per hour and a cruising speed around 125. Range was excellent, approximately 2,500 miles, which made it ideal for long-distance reconnaissance. But the PBY was slow, ungainly, vulnerable. Without fighter escort, it stood little chance against Japanese Zeros. Its defensive armament consisted of 4 50-caliber machine guns, barely adequate against determined attack. The aircraft required smooth water for landing and takeoff. Open ocean swells could tear the hull apart. Night operations were extremely hazardous, even under ideal conditions. The mission to Corregidor would be anything but ideal. 6,500 miles round trip, 4 refueling stops. 2 of those stops would be at Lake Lanao on Mindanao, in the southern Philippines, surrounded by Japanese forces. The actual landing at Corregidor would happen at night, on open water, under a full moon that would illuminate the aircraft for every Japanese gun crew within visual range. The landing site would be just offshore from the island, close enough that artillery fire could reach the planes while they sat on the water loading passengers. If Japanese fighters spotted them during daylight portions of the flight, the PBYs would be shot down. If storms hit during water landings, the aircraft could be destroyed by waves. If engines failed over Japanese-controlled territory, the crews would be captured or killed. If they successfully reached Corregidor but could not take off again, they would be trapped when the island fell. Commander Neal studied the intelligence, reports. He examined maps. He calculated fuel requirements, payload weights, and timing. Then he selected his crews. Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas F. Pollock would pilot Boat One. Pollock was 26 years old, a reservist from California who had joined Patrol Wing 10 in early 1942. He had flown combat missions over the Dutch East Indies, bombing Japanese ships and installations. He understood the PBY's limitations and how to coax maximum performance from the aging aircraft. His crew included Edgar T. Neal himself, who would serve as mission commander, plus Aviation Chief Machinists Mate M. Ferrara as plane captain, Radioman L., Gassett and H.F. Donahue, and Aviation Machinists Mate W.F. Drexel. Lieutenant Junior Grade Leroy C. Deed would pilot Boat 7. Deedy, known as Deeds to his squadron mates, was another reservist who had proven himself in combat. His crew included co-pilot Lieutenant Junior Grade William V. Goff, Aviation Chief Machinists Mate W.D. Eddy as plane captain, Aviation Machinists Mate M.C. Law, and Radioman E.W. Bedford and W.F. Kelly. Both crews knew the odds. This was not reconnaissance or bombing. This was flying deep into enemy territory to land at a location under active bombardment. Standard doctrine called for avoiding such missions. Standard doctrine had been written by people sitting safely in offices thousands of miles from combat. The doctrine did not account for 100 nurses trapped on a doomed island. The aircraft were loaded with cargo, medicines, anti-aircraft shell fuses that Corregidor desperately needed, radio repair parts, mail. Everything that could be stuffed into available space. The PBYs would fly heavy on the outbound leg, reducing range and performance but maximizing the supply delivery. April 27th, dawn at Perth. Commander Neil gathered the crews for final briefing. Flight path would take them north to Shark Bay, then Darwin. At Darwin, they would refuel and rest briefly. From Darwin, the route crossed the Timor Sea to Lake Lanao on Mindanao. The army was supposed to have cached fuel drums at Lake Lanao. A Filipino guide who knew the recognition signals would meet them. They would hide during daylight, camouflaging the aircraft with palm fronds and waiting for darkness. The actual flight to Corregidor would launch at 18:45 hours on April 29th. Timing was critical. They needed to arrive around 2300 hours, late enough that Japanese gun crews might be less alert after a long day of bombardment, but early enough to load and escape before dawn at 0500 hours. The landing site would be offshore from Corregidor's south docks, in a sheltered area where submarine rescue boats could bring passengers out to the plains. One more detail. April 29th was Emperor Hirohito's birthday. Intelligence suggested the Japanese would celebrate with an especially heavy bombardment. Corregidor would be burning when they arrived. That was actually advantageous. Fires would provide visual reference for navigation and landing. The Japanese would assume no American aircraft would dare approach during such an attack. They were almost certainly correct. But the mission was ordered anyway. Engines coughed to life. Propellers spun. Pollock ran through pre-flight checks methodically. Oil pressure good. Fuel mixture rich. Magnetos check. The PBY vibrated as engines reached operating temperature. Behind him, Commander Neil settled into the navigator's position. The crew took their stations, each man aware that this might be a one-way trip. At 1000 hours, April 27th, PBY Boat One lifted off from Perth. Boat 7 followed minutes later. The formation turned north, climbing to cruising altitude. Australia's coastline fell away behind them. Ahead lay 400 miles to Shark Bay, then 1200 miles to Darwin. Then the crossing into Japanese-controlled waters, where every mile increased the fight. Probability of detection. The flight to Darwin was uneventful but exhausting. 11 hours in the air. Crew members rotated positions, trying to stay alert. The cockpit was noisy, vibrating, cramped. Pollock flew mostly on instruments, relying on Neil's navigation to keep them on course. They landed at Darwin on April 28th at 0630 hours. The crews grabbed 4 hours of sleep while ground personnel refueled the aircraft and performed basic maintenance checks. At mid-morning, they took off again for Lake Lanao. This leg was the most dangerous so far. They would be flying over Japanese-occupied territory. Enemy fighters operated from airfields in the Celebes and Mindanao. Japanese Navy patrol boats cruised the waters below. A single visual contact would bring interceptors. Pollock kept the PBY low, just above the wavetops, where radar could not detect them easily, and visual acquisition was more difficult. The ocean stretched empty in all directions. Hours passed. Engines droned steadily. Fuel gauges dropped. Everything depended on finding Lake Lanao and the cached fuel. If the fuel was not there, or if the Japanese had discovered the cache, both aircraft would run dry and ditch at sea. At 0430 hours on April 29th, Pollock spotted Mindanao's coastline. He flew inland carefully, following valleys to avoid detection. Lake Lanao appeared as a dark patch among jungle-covered mountains. Neil flashed the coded recognition signal with an Aldis lamp. After tense seconds, an answering flash came from shore. Friends, not enemies. Pollock brought Boat One down on the lake surface gently. Water sprayed as the hull settled. He taxied toward the shoreline where Filipino soldiers and local Moro tribesmen waited. Within minutes, both PBYs were anchored in a hidden cove. Army personnel rolled fuel drums to the water's edge and began the laborious process of hand-pumping aviation gasoline into the aircraft tanks. Each plane required approximately 1,200 gallons. The work took hours in sweltering heat. While refueling proceeded, crews camouflaged the PBYs with cut palm fronds. The aircraft had to remain hidden until nightfall. Japanese patrols operated in the area. Just days earlier, a Japanese landing force had come ashore at Cotabato, only 37 miles away. The enemy was closing in on Lake Lanao from multiple directions. The day was miserable. Temperature reached 105 degrees. Mosquitoes and other insects swarmed. Sleep was impossible. The crews lay in shade, conserving energy, checking equipment, waiting for sunset. Local Moros gathered around the strange aircraft, curious but not threatening. The Filipino guide explained that Japanese forces were searching for guerrilla bases. American aircraft hiding at Lake Lanao represented a tempting target if discovered. Hours crawled past. Pollock reviewed the flight plan repeatedly. Lake Lanao to Corregidor, approximately 400 miles. Flying time 2.5 to 3 hours depending on winds. They would navigate primarily by dead reckoning, using compass headings and time-distance calculations. Radio silence was mandatory until they reached Corregidor. Japanese direction-finding stations could track transmissions and vector fighters to intercept. At 1800 hours, shadows lengthened across Lake Lanao. The sun sank toward the jungle canopy. Crews began final preparations. Engines were run up and checked. Fuel quantities verified. Cargo secured. Everyone understood what lay ahead. They would fly through darkness over enemy-controlled waters to land at a fortress under bombardment. If they succeeded, they would evacuate 46 people whose names they did not know. If they failed, no rescue would be attempted. There were no other aircraft available. No backup plan existed. At 1845 hours, exactly on schedule, both PBYs started engines. The sound echoed across the lake, surely audible for miles. But by the time any Japanese reaction could be organized, the aircraft would be gone. Filipino soldiers dragged the planes away from shore. Propellers churned water into foam. Pollock advanced throttles, and Boat One began its takeoff run. The PBY accelerated slowly, pushing against water resistance. Speed built gradually, 50 miles per hour, 60, 70. The hull lifted, planing across the surface. At 80 miles per hour, Pollock pulled back gently and Boat One unstuck, climbing sluggishly into the evening sky. Boat 7 followed a minute later. Both aircraft circled once, gaining altitude, then turned northwest toward Corregidor. Night fell quickly in the tropics. Within 30 minutes, darkness was complete, except for stars overhead. Pollock flew on instruments, trusting Neil's navigation. They maintained 500 feet altitude, low enough to avoid radar, but high enough for emergency maneuvering. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines ran smoothly, their rhythmic thunder the only sound besides wind noise and the crew's occasional radio checks. Time passed in slow increments. 1 hour, 2 hours. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. Pollock calculated range constantly. They had enough fuel to reach Corregidor, load passengers, return to Lake Lanao, and have perhaps 30 minutes reserve. There was no margin for delays, no allowance for combat maneuvering, no safety buffer if they had to divert. At approximately 22:40 hours, Neil spotted lights ahead, not city lights. Fires. Corregidor was burning. As they drew closer, the scale of destruction became apparent. The entire island glowed orange and red. Ammunition dumps exploded with visible flashes. Fires raged in what remained of barracks, warehouses, and support buildings. Smoke rose in thick columns, illuminated from below by flames. Pollock had seen combat before. He had bombed Japanese positions in the Dutch East Indies. He had witnessed ships sinking and aircraft burning. But he had never seen anything like Corregidor on April 29, 1942. The Japanese had concentrated every gun within range on the 5-square-mile fortress. 143 days of siege had built to this crescendo. Emperor Hirohito's birthday was being celebrated with an orgy of destruction that would continue without pause for 6 more days until the island surrendered. And into this inferno, 2 obsolete flying boats were about to land. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Pollock circled once at 1,500 feet, assessing the situation. Below, Corregidor resembled a vision of hell rendered in fire and smoke. The topside barracks area was completely engulfed. Battery Wheeler, Battery Hearn, and Battery Crockett, the massive coastal defense guns that once commanded Manila Bay, were silent, their crews dead or their positions destroyed. The parade ground where American soldiers had once drilled in peacetime now looked like the surface of the moon, cratered by months of bombardment. But the fires also revealed something crucial: the landing area. A sheltered stretch of water just offshore from the south docks, protected partially from the worst swells by Corregidor's landmass. It was not calm water by any standard, but it was the best they would find. More importantly, Pollock could see small boats moving toward the rendezvous point. The submarine rescue boats, dark shapes barely visible against darker water, were bringing passengers out from shore. Commander Neal radioed the island. Brief transmission, recognition codes exchanged, confirmation that the passengers were ready. The response came back almost immediately. Hurry. Japanese artillery had increased fire rate after dark. They might have spotted or heard the aircraft engines. Every minute on the water increased risk exponentially. Pollock brought Boat One around for final approach. He reduced altitude to 200 feet, then 100, then 50. The PBY descended toward black water, illuminated only by reflected firelight from the burning island. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Landing a flying boat at night required precise judgment of altitude, airspeed, and attitude. Too fast and the hull would skip violently, potentially tearing open. Too slow and they would stall, pancaking into the water hard enough to collapse the structure. Too steep an angle and the tail would strike first, wrecking the empennage. And all of this had to be done while Japanese artillery crews on Bataan, just 2 miles away, could see the aircraft silhouetted against flames. At 30 feet, Pollock cut throttles. The PBY settled, nose high, engines idling. Water rushed up to meet them. Touchdown. The hull slapped the surface, bounced slightly, settled again. Spray erupted on both sides as the aircraft ploughed through swells. Speed bled off. Pollock let the momentum carry them forward while he scanned for the rescue boats. There. 2 boats approaching from shore, their outlines barely distinguishable. Pollock taxied toward them carefully. The PBY wallowed in the swells, wing floats extended to provide stability. Behind him, crew members opened the side hatch. Cool night air rushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of smoke, cordite, and burning oil from the island. The first rescue boat came alongside. It carried 12 people. Army nurses in khaki coveralls, their faces drawn with exhaustion. A naval officer clutching a briefcase full of intelligence documents. 2 Army officers selected for evacuation because their knowledge of Philippine defenses would be valuable in planning future operations. A civilian woman, wife of a contractor, whose presence on Corregidor had been an accident of timing when the Japanese invaded. Helping hands reached down from the PBY's hatch. The passengers climbed awkwardly from the pitching boat into the aircraft. Some moved stiffly, their bodies weakened by months of inadequate food and constant stress. The nurses had been awake for days, working in the Malinta Tunnel Hospital where surgery continued around the clock. They carried small bags containing personal effects, medical instruments, and letters from men who would not be evacuated. Second Lieutenant Rosemary Hogan, an Army nurse who had worked at Hospital No. 1 on Bataan before evacuating to Corregidor, stepped into the aircraft and immediately began helping others aboard. She had spent the last 3 weeks treating wounded in conditions that made mockery of civilized medicine. Men screaming in pain while she amputated without anesthesia, soldiers dying of infected wounds because sulfur drugs had run out. The tunnel hospital stank of gangrene, blood, and death. And yet the nurses had continued working, maintaining discipline and compassion even as everything collapsed around them. Lieutenant Anne Bernatitis, the sole Navy nurse in the Philippines, was the last to board from the first boat. She had refused earlier evacuation opportunities, insisting on staying with her patients. Only a direct order from General Wainwright compelled her departure. She carried a small bag and wore the same coveralls she had worn in field hospitals for months. Her hands were scarred from surgical work. Her face showed the strain of watching men die when better facilities might have saved them. The second boat arrived. More nurses, more officers. A wounded soldier on a stretcher, his leg badly mangled by shrapnel, being evacuated because the Corregidor hospital lacked resources to treat him adequately. Every second counted. Crew members worked frantically to get everyone aboard and secured. The PBY was designed to carry cargo or a small number of passengers. They were loading more than twice the recommended capacity. On shore, artillery fire intensified. The Japanese were not specifically targeting the PBY, but they were maintaining their bombardment schedule. Shells screamed overhead, impacting on Corregidor's topside with thunderous detonations. Occasionally, a round fell short, splashing into the water near the aircraft. Each impact sent up a geyser of spray that rocked the flying boat. Pollock glanced at his watch. 20 hours. They had been on the water 12 minutes. Far too long. He shouted back to the cargo area. "How many more?" The answer came back. "One more boat. 8 passengers." Pollock swore quietly. The aircraft was already overloaded. 8 more people would push them beyond any reasonable safety margin. But there was no choice. Those 8 people represented the difference between freedom and captivity, between survival and probable death. The PBY would carry them or die trying. The third boat appeared out of darkness. More nurses, more officers, 1 civilian. They scrambled aboard, squeezing into every available space. The interior of the PBY now resembled a packed commuter train, bodies pressed together, luggage stowed in overhead spaces, people sitting on the deck, standing in the aisle, crouching wherever room existed. Commander Neal did a quick head count. 23 passengers aboard Boat 1. Boat 7 was loading simultaneously about 300 yards away. Another 23 passengers for DD's aircraft. 46 total, exactly as planned. The mission was succeeding. Now they just had to survive the next 30 minutes. Pollock signaled the rescue boat crews. Cast off. The Filipino boatmen pushed away and headed back toward shore. Their job was done. They would return to Corregidor and face whatever came next, while the people they had just delivered to the PBYs would fly to safety. Taking off would be the most dangerous part. The PBY was grossly overloaded. Fuel, passengers, cargo, everything combined to create a gross weight far exceeding design limits. The aircraft would be sluggish, slow to accelerate, reluctant to unstick from the water, and they would have to do it while illuminated by fires, potentially under direct observation by Japanese gun crews. Pollock taxied into position for takeoff. He needed the longest possible water run to build speed. He pointed the nose toward open water, away from shore, giving himself maximum distance. The engines were already running at operating temperature. He ran them up to full power, holding the aircraft stationary with wheel brakes. Manifold pressure climbed. The PBY shook with restrained power. He released brakes. The flying boat lurched forward, accelerating slowly. Too slowly. The hull pushed, through water like a plough through heavy soil. Spray erupted on both sides. Speed built incrementally. 40 miles per hour. 50. 60. The hull began to lift, rising onto the step, that critical point where hydrodynamic forces reduced drag and allowed acceleration. 70 miles per hour. 80. Pollock held the control column neutral, letting the aircraft find its own attitude. Too much back pressure would increase drag and prevent unsticking. Not enough, and they would never rotate off the water. It was a delicate balance, feel more than technique, experience accumulated through hundreds of water takeoffs. 90 miles per hour. The hull was skipping now, barely touching the surface. Still not enough speed to fly. Pollock kept throttles firewalled. The engines screamed at maximum RPM. Fuel consumption spiked. Behind him, passengers gripped whatever handholds they could find, sensing the danger even if they did not understand the technical details. 100 miles per hour. The PBY shuddered, balanced on the edge between water and air. Pollock eased back on the control column. The nose came up slightly. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the hull broke free of the water completely and they were airborne, climbing sluggishly into darkness. But they were not safe. Altitude was 50 feet, airspeed 105 miles per hour. Climb rate barely 200 feet per minute. The aircraft was on the ragged edge of stall, barely maintaining controlled flight. Pollock held the climb attitude carefully, trading speed for altitude inch by agonizing inch. Somewhere in the darkness to his left, Japanese gunners on Bataan were tracking the sound of engines. Artillery could not engage aerial targets effectively, but anti-aircraft guns could. If Japanese anti-aircraft crews spotted the PBY and opened fire, the slow-moving, low-altitude flying boat would be an easy target. 100 feet altitude, 150, 200. Airspeed crept, up to 110 miles per hour as the aircraft gained energy. Pollock held the climb, fighting the temptation to level off and run. They needed altitude for the long flight back to Lake Lanao. Every foot gained now was insurance against engine failure or other emergency later. 300 feet, 400. The climb rate improved slightly as airspeed increased. Pollock finally allowed himself a breath. They were going to make it. Boat One had successfully loaded passengers under fire and taken off from open water at night while overloaded. The mission was halfway complete. Behind him, Boat 7 was beginning its takeoff run. Pollock circled slowly, climbing and waiting for Deed to join formation. He could see the other PBY's navigation lights, dimly visible against the glow of burning Corregidor. The aircraft accelerated across the water, hull throwing spray, engines roaring at full power. Deed's takeoff appeared normal at first. The PBY rose onto the step, accelerated further, began to unstick. Then something went wrong. The aircraft settled back onto the water instead of climbing. Deed was having the same problem Pollock had faced, maybe worse. The overload was too much. Speed was inadequate. The PBY could not break free of surface tension. Deed cut throttles, aborted the attempt, and taxied back for another try. Pollock watched tensely. Every additional minute on the water increased danger. Japanese artillery fire continued unabated. If a shell scored a direct hit on the PBY while it sat on the water, 23 passengers and 6 crew members would die instantly. D-Day positioned for another attempt. This time he taxied even farther, giving himself maximum water run. Engines came up to full power. The PBY started its run, accelerating down the improvised water runway. 40 miles per hour. 50. 60. Onto the step. 70. 80. 90. This time Deed held the run longer, letting speed build further before attempting to rotate. 100 miles per hour. 105. Deed eased back on the controls. The nose came up. The PBY hesitated, balanced on the knife edge between hydrodynamic and aerodynamic forces. Then it broke free, climbing away from the water in a shallow ascent. Both aircraft were airborne. Pollock set course for Lake Lanao, heading southeast. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines settled into steady cruise power. Fuel consumption returned to normal rates. Behind him in the cargo area, passengers found whatever positions they could and tried to process what had just happened. They had been on Corregidor, a fortress under siege, facing certain capture and imprisonment. Now they were in a crowded aircraft flying through darkness towards safety. Some of the nurses wept quietly. Others sat in stunned silence. Lieutenant Bernatitis helped arrange the wounded soldier more comfortably, improvising a more secure position for his stretcher. The civilian passenger clutched her small bag and stared at nothing. The Army and Navy officers reviewed the intelligence documents they had brought, verifying that nothing had been lost in the frantic boarding. The flight to Lake Lanao took 2.5 hours. Pollock flew primarily on instruments, checking position occasionally against stars and calculated time distance. Radio silence was maintained except for brief transmissions between the two aircraft. Japanese listening posts might intercept communications, but by the time they could react, the PBYs would be long gone. At 0200 hours, Lake Lanao appeared ahead, a dark patch among darker mountains. Pollock descended cautiously, searching for the landing area. The moon had set. Visibility was minimal. He circled once, flashing the recognition signal. The response came immediately. Filipino soldiers were still guarding the area, still maintaining the supply cache. Pollock brought Boat One down on the lake surface. The landing was textbook, smooth and controlled despite darkness. He taxied toward shore, killed engines, and crew members threw anchor lines to waiting Filipinos. Boat 7 landed 2 minutes later, both aircraft secured safely. Passengers disembarked onto boats that ferried them to shore. They would rest for a few hours while the PBYs refueled for the long flight back to Australia. The Army provided what food and water they could spare. The nurses, used to far worse conditions, made no complaints. They had survived Bataan. They had survived Corregidor. This jungle camp seemed almost comfortable by comparison, but the mission was not over. They still had to fly out of Japanese-controlled territory without being intercepted. The success achieved at Corregidor could be undone in seconds if enemy fighters spotted them during daylight. At 0500 hours, refueling was complete. Passengers reboarded. The plan called for the PBYs to depart immediately, flying south through darkness to put maximum distance between themselves and Japanese airfields before dawn. The first leg would take them to Mindanao's southern coast, then across the Sea toward the Dutch East Indies. Pollock started engines. The PBY coughed to life, propellers spinning up to operating RPM. He taxied away from shore, preparing for takeoff. Behind him, Boat 7 was doing the same. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then disaster struck. As Boat 1 accelerated across the lake surface, something scraped along the hull with a grinding, tearing sound. Pollock felt the aircraft shudder. Speed dropped. Water began spraying into the cargo compartment through a breach in the hull. They had hit a submerged rock. In the darkness, nobody had seen it. The impact had punctured the hull, tearing a gash approximately 1 foot long just above the waterline. Not large enough to sink the aircraft immediately, but large enough to make flight impossible. Water would pour in once they were airborne. The damage would worsen. The PBY would go down. Pollock cut throttles and taxied back to shore. Crew members and Filipino soldiers examined the damage. The puncture was serious. Proper repair would require a shipyard, specialized tools, and time they did not have. Japanese forces were closing in on Lake Lanao. The longer they stayed, the greater the risk of discovery and capture. Commander Neal made the decision. Patch it. Use whatever materials were available. Make it good enough to fly. They would attempt the return journey and hope the improvised repair held. For the next hour, crew members worked frantically. They stuffed the hole with rags, canvas, anything that would slow the water flow. They sealed the patches with tar, fabric, and prayers. The repair was crude, marginal, barely adequate, but it was the best they could do under field conditions with limited materials. Dawn was approaching. They had to leave. Pollock looked at the patch job and calculated odds. The hull would leak. Water would accumulate in the bilges. Pumps would have to run continuously to keep ahead of flooding. The added weight would reduce range and performance. If the patch failed catastrophically, they would ditch at sea hundreds of miles from land. He made his choice. They would fly. The alternative was staying at Lake Lanao and facing certain capture when the Japanese arrived. Better to risk the ocean than guarantee imprisonment. At 0630 hours, with dawn breaking over the mountains, Pollock attempted takeoff. The damaged PBY accelerated slowly, water spraying through the patched hull despite the repairs. The aircraft felt heavy, sluggish. But it gained speed. 70 miles per hour, 80, 90. Pollock rotated and the PBY unstuck, climbing weakly into morning sky. Water sloshed in the bilges. The electric pump whined continuously, barely keeping pace with the leak. Pollock maintained careful altitude, knowing that any additional stress on the damaged hull could worsen the breach. He climbed to 1,000 feet and leveled off, setting course south. Boat 7, undamaged, climbed ahead and took position as escort. Deed would navigate and provide cover if needed. Pollock would focus on keeping his wounded aircraft flying. The return journey became an endurance test. Every hour brought new concerns. Fuel consumption was higher than planned because of the extra drag from the damaged hull. The leak worsened gradually, forcing crew members to use hand pumps in addition to the electric system. Passengers bailed water with canteen cups and helmets, forming a bucket brigade to keep the bilges from flooding. But the PBY continued flying. The engines ran smoothly. Navigation was accurate. Hours accumulated. They crossed hostile waters without encountering Japanese patrols. Luck, skill, and the vastness of the Pacific Ocean combined to protect them. At 1400 hours on May 1st, the Australian coast appeared on the horizon. Pollock descended toward Darwin, preparing for landing. The damaged hull made water landing risky, but they had no choice. The PBY was a flying boat, not designed for runway operations. He brought the aircraft down carefully, minimizing impact forces. The hull hit water and immediately began taking on more fluid through the compromised section. But they were down. They were in friendly territory. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, securing it before it could sink. Passengers disembarked onto boats. 23 people who had been on Corregidor 36 hours earlier now stepped onto Australian soil. The nurses, the officers, the wounded soldier, the civilian woman, all safe. Against odds that military planners had assessed as nearly prohibitive, the mission had succeeded. Boat 7 landed shortly after, undamaged and without incident. Deed shut down engines and his crew helped secure the aircraft. They had completed the mission exactly as briefed. 6,500 miles, 4 refueling stops, landing under fire. Takeoff overloaded. Navigation through enemy territory. And return with all passengers safe. The statistics were remarkable. Operation Gridiron, as it was designated, had achieved a nearly perfect result. 46 passengers evacuated. 0 casualties during the evacuation phase. 2 aircraft dispatched, 2 aircraft returned, albeit 1 damaged. Flight time for the undamaged Boat 7 was 5.5 days. Flight time for the damaged Boat 1 was 6.5 days. Of the approximately 6,500 miles flown, 3,900 had been over Japanese-controlled airspace or waters. The passengers were debriefed. The nurses provided intelligence about conditions on Corregidor and Bataan. The officers delivered their documents to headquarters. The wounded soldier received proper medical treatment for the first time in weeks. Everyone was given food, water, clean clothes, and beds with actual mattresses. For the PBY crews, there was quiet satisfaction but little fanfare. They had done their job. They had flown the mission as ordered. The fact that it succeeded did not erase the fact that it had been necessary. Corregidor was still burning. Thousands of Americans and Filipinos remained trapped. The war was far from over. On May 6, 1942, exactly 1 week after the evacuation mission, Corregidor surrendered. General Wainwright had no choice. Ammunition was exhausted. Water was nearly gone. Food supplies were depleted. Artillery had destroyed most defensive positions. The Japanese landing force was ashore and fighting toward Malinta Tunnel. Further resistance would accomplish nothing except additional casualties. 11,000 American and Filipino troops went into Japanese captivity. Many would die in prison camps. Some would survive the war, carrying physical and psychological scars. The surrender of Corregidor marked the completion of Japanese conquest of the Philippines. It would be 3 years before American forces returned. but 46 people had escaped. 46 people who would have faced captivity instead flew to safety because 2 PBY crews accepted a mission that conventional wisdom labelled suicidal. Those 46 people included nurses who would serve in other theatres, officers who would plan future operations, and a wounded soldier who recovered and returned to duty. The nurses evacuated from Corregidor did not sit idle after reaching Australia. Lieutenant Anne Bernatitus was assigned to hospital duty in the South Pacific. She would serve throughout the war, eventually participating in the invasion of Okinawa, where she treated casualties aboard hospital ships. She survived the war and received numerous commendations for her service. But she always remembered the night of April 29th, climbing into a PBY while Corregidor burned around her. Second, Lieutenant Rosemary Hogan and other nurses from the April 29th evacuation were dispersed to various hospitals and medical units. They brought with them hard-won expertise in combat medicine, field surgery, and triage under fire. The lessons learned in Philippines hospitals saved countless lives in later campaigns. Some nurses were not so fortunate. Several of those who boarded the PBYs on April 29th had their aircraft damaged during the return flight. One group was stranded when their plane had to make emergency repairs. They were eventually captured by Japanese forces advancing through Mindanao. These nurses spent the rest of the war in Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. They survived, but endured years of hardship, hunger, and uncertainty before liberation in February 1945. The damaged PBY Boat One never flew again. The hull breach, temporarily patched at Lake Lanao and held together through desperate hours over open ocean, proved beyond field repair capabilities. Navy maintenance crews at Darwin examined the aircraft and delivered their verdict: salvage what parts could be used, scrap the rest. The flying boat, that had carried 23 people to safety from burning Corregidor, ended its service as a parts donor for other aircraft. This was the unglamorous reality of war in the Pacific. Aircraft were tools, expendable assets measured in operational hours and mission success rates. Boat One had completed its mission. The fact that it could not fly again was secondary to the fact that 46 people had reached Australia alive. Boat 7 continued flying for several more months, conducting reconnaissance patrols and transport missions, until engine wear and structural fatigue finally grounded it permanently. By then, newer PBY 5 amperes amphibious variants were entering service, with retractable landing gear that allowed operation from both water and runways. The old pure flying boats, workhorses of early Pacific operations, were being phased out. Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Pollock received recognition for his role in Operation Gridiron, though the mission remained classified for some time. He continued flying combat operations throughout the war, eventually transitioning to transport duties. He survived the war and returned to civilian life in California. For the rest of his life, he carried memories of that night landing at Corregidor, the fires illuminating his approach, the desperate scramble to load passengers before Japanese artillery found their range. Lieutenant Junior Grade Leroy Deed similarly continued operational flying. His undamaged aircraft and successful completion of the Corregidor mission without incident demonstrated the kind of steady competence that characterized the best naval aviators. He flew dozens of additional missions before rotating stateside for instructor duty, where he trained new pilots in PBY operations. The lessons learned from Operation Gridiron about overwater navigation, night landings, and operating in hostile territory became part of the curriculum. Commander Edgar T. Neal, who had planned and commanded the mission, remained in the Pacific Theater coordinating what remained of Patrol Wing 10's operations. The wing had started the war with 46 aircraft. By May 1942, only a handful remained operational. Neal's skill at improvising solutions with inadequate resources kept his squadrons flying despite overwhelming disadvantages. He understood that every reconnaissance flight, every supply run, every evacuation mission contributed incrementally to eventual Allied victory. The strategic importance of Operation Gridiron extended beyond the immediate rescue of 46 individuals. The mission demonstrated that American forces retained offensive capability even during the darkest period of the Pacific War. While Japan celebrated its conquest of the Philippines, American aircraft had penetrated deep into enemy-controlled territory, conducted operations under fire, and withdrawn successfully. This psychological impact mattered. For Japanese planners, the Corregidor evacuation suggested that American forces were more capable and more aggressive than previously assessed. If flying boats could reach Corregidor at night, what else might American aviation accomplish? The uncertainty forced allocation of additional defensive resources, fighter patrols, and anti-aircraft batteries to guard against future raids. These resources, diverted to defend against threats that might not materialize, were unavailable for offensive operations elsewhere. For American planners, Operation Gridiron validated the concept of long-range air evacuation under combat conditions. The techniques developed for the mission, impromptu refueling at remote locations, navigation through hostile airspace, landing on open water at night, became standardized procedures for later operations. The PBY's versatility as a rescue platform was proven definitively. Throughout the remainder of the war, PBY squadrons conducted hundreds of similar missions, pulling downed pilots from the ocean, evacuating personnel from isolated positions, and delivering critical supplies to cut-off units. The nurses evacuated from Corregidor represented a broader category of personnel, whose knowledge and experience made them strategically valuable. They had treated thousands of casualties under primitive conditions. They understood tropical diseases, combat wounds, and field surgery in ways that textbooks could not teach. Dispersed to hospitals across the Pacific and in the United States, these nurses trained others, developed improved protocols, and contributed directly to reduced mortality rates in later campaigns. Medical evacuation by air, pioneered in New Guinea and validated by missions like Operation Gridiron, revolutionized combat medicine. Previously, wounded soldiers faced days or weeks of transport from front lines to proper hospitals. By 1944, air evacuation meant that critically wounded personnel reached surgical facilities within hours. The death rate from wounds dropped dramatically. Soldiers knew that if they survived the initial injury, rapid evacuation gave them excellent chances of recovery. This knowledge affected morale, willingness to take risks, and overall combat effectiveness. The broader pattern of PBY operations in the Pacific demonstrated the aircraft's adaptability. Designed as a patrol bomber for fleet reconnaissance, the Catalina evolved into multiple specialized roles. Black Cat squadrons, flying PBYs painted matte black, conducted night attacks on Japanese shipping from mid-1942 through 1945. Operating at masthead height in darkness, these aircraft sank or damaged over 100,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. The same basic airframe that evacuated nurses from Corregidor later torpedoed Japanese transports, dropped bombs on enemy installations, and mined harbors across the Pacific. Dumbo missions, search and rescue operations named after Disney's flying elephant, became another critical PBY role. When carrier aircraft attacked Japanese bases, PBY Dumbos orbited offshore, ready to land and rescue pilots who ditched in the ocean. The psychological impact was enormous. Carrier pilots knew that even if their aircraft was shot down, rescue was possible. This reduced hesitation about pressing attacks over water. Hundreds of American aviators survived the war because PBY crews risked their own lives to pull them from the Pacific. Lieutenant Nathan Green Gordon's mission on February 15, 1944, exemplified PBY rescue operations at their most audacious. Flying in support of 5th Air Force attacks on Cavite, Gordon landed his PBY Catalina 4 separate times under intense enemy fire to rescue 15 downed aircrewmen. Each landing brought him within range of Japanese coastal artillery. Each takeoff, performed while overloaded with rescued personnel, pushed the aircraft beyond design limits. Gordon received the Medal of Honor, the only PBY pilot so decorated during World War II. His mission was exceptional, but it represented the same willingness to accept extreme risk for rescue operations that Pollock and Deed had demonstrated at Corregidor. The contrast between American and Japanese approaches to rescue operations revealed fundamental differences in how each side valued personnel. American forces devoted significant resources to recovering downed pilots and isolated troops. Submarines conducted lifeguard duty. PBY squadrons flew dedicated rescue missions. The calculation was pragmatic as much as humanitarian. Experienced pilots were expensive to train and difficult to replace. Recovering them for return to combat multiplied force effectiveness. Japanese forces, by contrast, devoted minimal resources to rescue operations. Pilots who ditched at sea frequently drowned or died of exposure because no organized effort existed to recover them. This contributed to Japan's declining pilot quality as the war progressed. Experienced aviators died, unnecessarily in situations where rescue would have been possible with proper planning. Replacements, rushed through abbreviated training, lacked the skills needed for combat effectiveness. By mid-1944, Japan was fielding pilots with less than 200 hours total flight time against American pilots averaging over 500 hours. The mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against Japan. The United States produced approximately 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Japan produced approximately 28,000. American pilot training graduated 60,000 pilots in 1944. Japan graduated approximately 5,000. These disparities, combined with better rescue and recovery operations, created an overwhelming advantage that no amount of Japanese courage or tactical skill could offset. Operation Gridiron occurred during the period when these patterns were being established. April 1942 marked the low point of American fortunes in the Pacific. Bataan had fallen. Corregidor was doomed. Japanese forces controlled everything from Burma to the Central Pacific Islands. Yet even then, American forces were developing the capabilities, techniques, and mindset that would eventually reverse the tide. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo, launched from the carrier Hornet on April 18, one day before the Corregidor evacuation, demonstrated American willingness to strike back regardless of cost. The raid accomplished minimal physical damage but enormous psychological effect. Japanese planners, who had assumed the home islands were invulnerable, suddenly faced the reality of American bombers over their capital. The raid accelerated Japanese plans for the Midway operation, which culminated in decisive American victory in June. The Battle of Midway validated another PBY contribution. Patrol Squadron 23 and 24 Catalinas, conducting long-range searches, located the Japanese carrier force on June 3rd. The intelligence allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position American carriers for ambush. When Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway Island on June 4th, American dive bombers caught them at their most vulnerable moment. 4 Japanese carriers, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, sank in a single day. The balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly, and it began with PBY crews finding the Japanese fleet through patient reconnaissance. The thread connecting these events ran through personnel, training, and institutional learning. The same PBY squadrons that evacuated Corregidor conducted reconnaissance at Midway. The same Navy that organized Operation Gridiron developed Black Cat tactics for night attack. The same mindset that accepted risk to rescue 46 people from a doomed fortress later accepted risk to rescue single downed pilots from the ocean. This was the less visible side of military power. Not the dramatic carrier battles or amphibious assaults, but the unglamorous work of logistics, evacuation, search and rescue, reconnaissance, and transport. PBY squadrons flew thousands of missions that received no headlines. They delivered mail to isolated garrisons. They transported medical supplies to forward areas. They searched empty ocean for submarines that were never found. And, occasionally, they flew into burning islands at night to pull people out of hell. The personal stories of Operation Gridiron participants reflected the broader experience of millions who served. Most returned to civilian life after the war and never spoke extensively about their experiences. Thomas Pollock returned to California and worked in aviation-related industries. Leroy Deed settled in the Midwest and became a flight instructor. Anne Bernatitus continued nursing, eventually retiring after a distinguished career. They were ordinary people who had done extraordinary things under circumstances they never sought. The psychological toll of combat operations was rarely discussed in the 1940s and 50s. Post-traumatic stress was not yet understood or recognized as a legitimate condition. Veterans were expected to readjust to civilian life without complaint. Many succeeded, at least outwardly, building careers and families and seemingly normal lives. But some carried wounds that never healed. Nightmares about burning islands and overloaded aircraft struggling to take off. Guilt about surviving when others did not. Questions about whether different decisions might have changed outcomes. For the nurses evacuated from Corregidor, the experience of captivity shaped those who were recaptured, and the experience of escape shaped those who made it to Australia. Lieutenant Anne Bernatitus spent decades processing her time in the Philippines. She had treated men with wounds that would have been survivable in a proper hospital, but were fatal in Malinta Tunnel. She had held hands with dying soldiers who asked her to write letters to their families. She had walked away from patients who needed her because orders required evacuation. The nurses who were recaptured after their damaged aircraft went down faced 3 years of imprisonment at Santo Tomas. Conditions in the camp deteriorated steadily as the war progressed. Food rations decreased. Medical supplies ran out. Prisoners survived on rice and whatever vegetables they could grow. Some died of malnutrition, disease, or untreated medical conditions. Those who survived liberation in February 1945 weighed on average 70 to 80 pounds less than their pre-war weight. Yet even in captivity, the nurses continued their profession. They established a hospital within Santo Tomas using improvised equipment and scavenged supplies. They treated fellow prisoners. They maintained discipline and standards despite impossible conditions. When American forces liberated the camp, they found nurses who had continued functioning as medical professionals throughout years of imprisonment. This exemplified a pattern repeated across the Pacific War. Individuals facing overwhelming adversity maintained professionalism, discipline, and humanity. Pilots flew worn-out aircraft on dangerous missions. Ground crews kept planes flying with salvaged parts. Medics treated wounded under fire. Each person contributed incrementally to eventual victory through thousands of small acts of courage and competence. Operation Gridiron represented one such contribution. 2 aircraft, 2 crews, 46 passengers. In the grand scope of World War II, which involved millions of personnel and spanned the globe, this was a tiny operation. Yet, it mattered. It mattered to the 46 people who escaped captivity. It mattered to the families who received their loved ones back instead of telegram notifications. It mattered to commanders who gained experienced personnel for future operations. And it mattered as proof that even in the darkest times, even when defeat seemed certain, resistance remained possible. The technical lessons from the mission influenced PBY operations throughout the war. Overloading limits were better understood. Night water landing procedures were refined. Refueling protocols at remote sites became standardized. Damage assessment and field repair techniques improved. Each of these incremental improvements, multiplied across hundreds of missions, saved lives and increased effectiveness. The cultural lesson was equally important. American forces in the Pacific developed a reputation for never abandoning personnel. Soldiers knew that if they were cut off, rescue attempts would be made. Pilots knew that if they ditched at sea, search and rescue would launch. Prisoners of war knew that eventual liberation remained a goal. This knowledge affected morale, cohesion, and willingness to take necessary risks. Japanese forces, by contrast, operated under a cultural framework that emphasized death before dishonor. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death rather than surrender. This created desperate, costly battles where Japanese troops refused to yield even when defeat was inevitable. It also meant that Japanese personnel who were isolated had little expectation of rescue. The contrast in approaches reflected deeper cultural differences that shaped how each side conducted the war. The ultimate measure of Operation Gridiron's success was simple. 46 people survived who might have died. Some lived full lives, raising families, pursuing careers, contributing to their communities. Some suffered physical or psychological trauma but persevered. All carried memories of April 29, 1942, when fires lit the horizon, and two obsolete flying boats represented the difference between hope and despair. Thomas Pollock, in later years, occasionally spoke about the mission. He described the approach to Corregidor, seeing the island burning below, knowing that landing there violated every principle of safe aviation. He described the loading process, helping exhausted nurses climb aboard, feeling the aircraft settle lower in the water as each additional person boarded. He described the takeoff, engines screaming at full power, the PBY reluctant to unstick, everyone aboard knowing they were seconds from either escape or disaster. And he described the moment when the hull finally broke free of water and they climbed into darkness. The relief. The realization that they had succeeded against odds that should have been prohibitive. The knowledge that 23 people in the cargo area behind him would see another sunrise because he and his crew had accepted the mission. That moment, repeated in thousands of combat situations across World War II, defined the generation. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, choosing action over paralysis. Accepting risk because the alternative was accepting defeat. The decisions made in cockpits, on deck plates, in jungle clearings, and inside burning tunnels accumulated into victory. Operation Gridiron did not change the outcome of the war. Corregidor still fell. The Philippines remained under Japanese occupation for 3 more years. The Pacific War continued for another 3 years after April 1942, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaping the geopolitical landscape. But within that vast conflict, small missions mattered. Individual actions mattered. The choice to fly into fire rather than accept that 46 people were beyond help mattered. The PBY Catalina, ungainly and slow, represented American industrial capacity and operational flexibility. Over 3,000 were built during the war. They operated in every theater, from the Aleutians to the South Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Some sank submarines, some bombed targets, some conducted reconnaissance, some rescued downed pilots, some evacuated personnel from doomed positions. And on the night of April 29th to 30th, 1942, 2 of them landed at Corregidor while the island burned. The fires that illuminated Pollock's approach that night came from ammunition dumps, fuel storage, barracks, and defensive positions systematically destroyed by Japanese artillery. Emperor Hirohito's birthday had been celebrated with 10,000 shells and bombs concentrated on 5 square miles of rock and fortification. The bombardment would continue for 6 more days until General Wainwright surrendered on May 6th. But for one night, in the midst of that inferno, rescue was possible. Not for everyone. Not for the 11,000 troops who would go into captivity. Not for the hundreds who had already died from wounds, disease, or bombardment. But for 46 people, rescue was possible because 2 PBY crews accepted a mission that conventional wisdom labeled suicidal. The forbidden tactic became standard procedure. The dangerous method became routine. The impossible mission became a template for hundreds of successful operations. Thomas Pollock and Leroy Deed did not live to see the final victory in the Pacific. Their contributions happened in the darkness of early defeat, when success meant survival rather than conquest. But their legacy lived in every subsequent rescue mission, in every pilot pulled from the ocean, in every isolated garrison evacuated before the enemy closed in. Edward Butch O'Hare defended Lexington alone against 9 bombers in February 1942, buying time for his carrier to survive. 4 months later, Pollock and Deed flew into Corregidor to extract 46 people from a doomed fortress. Both missions represented the same principle, refusing to accept that some situations were beyond help, fighting when fighting seemed futile, risking everything because some things were worth the risk. This was the character of the generation that won World War II, not superhuman, not invincible, just determined to do their jobs regardless of cost. They flew worn-out aircraft on dangerous missions. They landed on hostile shores under fire. They treated wounded in jungle hospitals without proper equipment. They kept fighting when defeat seemed certain, and incrementally, through thousands of such efforts, they turned the tide. The sun rose over Lake Lanao on April 30th, 1942, as damaged PBY Boat One struggled into the sky, water streaming from its punctured hull, passengers bailing with helmets and canteen cups, engines straining at maximum power. The aircraft should not have been flyable. The mission should not have been attempted. Success should have been impossible. But the aircraft flew. The mission succeeded. The impossible became real, because two crews decided that 46 lives were worth the risk. Because Commander Neil planned carefully and executed boldly, because Filipino soldiers cached fuel at a hidden lake and helped disguise aircraft from Japanese patrols. Because passengers, exhausted and traumatized, found strength to bail water during the flight. Because everyone involved understood their role and performed it under conditions that would excuse failure. This is how wars are won, not through single decisive battles, though those matter. Not through superior technology alone, though that helps. Wars are won through accumulated acts of courage, competence, and determination. Through missions that succeed despite overwhelming odds. Through people who refuse to accept that some things are impossible. April 29, 1942. Dawn breaking over Port Moresby had belonged to Edward Lana and his forbidden skip bombing technique. Dusk over Corregidor belonged to Thomas Pollock and Leroy Deed, landing flying boats on hostile waters under fire to pull 46 people from hell. Both missions violated conventional wisdom. Both succeeded through skill, courage, and determination. Both represented the character of forces that would, eventually, win the Pacific War. The fires that burned on Corregidor that night have long since been extinguished. The island today is a memorial and tourist site, quiet and peaceful, bearing scars from battles fought 8 decades ago. The PBYs that flew the mission are gone, scrapped or sunk, vanished like the men who crewed them. But the lesson remains. Some missions demand attempting despite impossible odds. Some lives are worth risking everything to save. Some acts of courage, performed in darkness while islands burn, echo across decades to remind future generations what humans can achieve when pushed to the absolute edge. 2 pilots, 2 aircraft, 46 souls. And one night, when the forbidden became necessary, the dangerous became standard, and the impossible became history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.